She's with me, said the human plumber. The dragon princess froze at the table. Princess Lyra adjusted her ceremonial armor for the 100th time that evening, the violet gold scales catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. The diplomatic hall buzzed with conversations in dozens of alien languages, each species trying to appear more important than the others. She hated these gatherings with every fiber of her being, but duty demanded her presence at the peace negotiations between her people and the Vortak Confederacy. The Drakmor Empire had been at war with the insectoid Vortak for 50 brutal years. Tonight was supposed to mark the beginning of peace talks, though Lyra suspected the Vortak had no real interest in peace. They wanted submission, wrapped in pretty diplomatic language. Around her, the most powerful beings in known space mingled with careful politeness. The tall, graceful ethereals floated near the quantum buffet, their translucent bodies shimmering with bioluminescence. The rock-like granite collective stood in perfect formation near the wall, communicating through vibrations too low for most species to hear. Even the mysterious Silicon Collective had sent representatives, their chrome forms reflecting the room's opulence. Lyra found herself seated at the high table, directly across from General Vortak and his delegation. The Vortak general was an imposing figure even by his species standards, standing nearly 8 feet tall with razor-sharp mandibles and compound eyes that seemed to catalog every weakness in the room. His chittering laugh had been echoing through the hall all evening, usually at the expense of some smaller species representative. The formal dinner had been progressing with typical diplomatic tedium, when suddenly, a loud clang echoed through the grand hall. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as every head turned toward the sound. One of the maintenance hatches in the floor had burst open with a metallic crash that seemed to reverberate off the crystal walls. A pair of worn work boots appeared first, followed by oil-stained coveralls and a tool belt that jangled with every movement. The human who emerged looked completely oblivious to the hundreds of alien dignitaries staring at him in stunned silence. His hair was disheveled, his hands were dirty, and he had the slightly dazed expression of someone who had been crawling through tight spaces for far too long. Dave wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a small streak of grease across his brow. He glanced around the room with mild curiosity, as if he had expected to find another maintenance corridor but had instead discovered a formal dinner. "Party. Sorry about that, folks," he announced to the assembly with the casual tone of someone addressing co-workers in a break room, rather than galactic royalty. "Just need to check the main filtration junction under table 7. The whole waste processing system has been acting up for 3 days now, and I think I finally tracked down the problem." The silence that followed was so complete that the soft hum of the station's life support systems became audible. Princess Lyra felt her cheeks burn with secondhand embarrassment. Of all the tables in the vast hall, table 7 happened to be the high table where she sat with the most important delegates. Without waiting for permission or acknowledgement, Dave dropped to his hands and knees and began crawling under their table. The sound of clanking tools and muttered technical observations drifted up from beneath the pristine white tablecloth. Princess Lyra's carefully maintained composure began to crack as she realized that a human maintenance worker was literally underneath her chair, probably looking at the underside of her ceremonial armor. The Vortak delegation erupted into their species equivalent of laughter, a harsh chittering sound that filled the hall like breaking glass. General Vortak's mandibles clicked together in obvious amusement, and his compound eyes glittered with malicious joy. Several of the smaller species representatives began whispering among themselves, some pointing discreetly at the high table. "Fascinating," General Vortak said, his voice cutting through the chittering of his subordinates. The mighty Drakmor Empire, rulers of 17 star systems, reduced to sharing their table with maintenance personnel. Perhaps this explains why your military performance has been so disappointing in recent years. Princess Lyra felt her claws extend involuntarily, a reflexive response to the insult that she barely managed to suppress. The general's words stung because they contained just enough truth to be genuinely hurtful. The war had not been going well for her people. They had lost 3 outer rim colonies in the past year alone, and their fleet was stretched thin trying to protect the remaining systems. More clanking sounds emerged from under the table, followed by what sounded like Dave having a quiet argument with a particularly stubborn piece of equipment. Princess Lyra closed her eyes and tried to center herself using the meditation techniques her tutors had taught her. But the situation was rapidly spiraling beyond anything her diplomatic training had prepared her for. "Your Highness appears distressed," General Vorthak continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Perhaps the princess would prefer to explain to the assembly why the Great Dragon Empire requires the assistance of human— What is the term? Blue-collar workers? The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Princess Lyra felt the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on her shoulders. Her father, Emperor Dracus, had specifically chosen her to lead this diplomatic mission because of her reputation for grace under pressure. She was supposed to project strength and dignity, to remind the galaxy that the Drakmor Empire remained a force to be respected, despite their recent military setbacks. Instead, she found herself sitting frozen with mortification, while a human plumber worked on them, plumbing beneath her feet, and a Vortak general publicly mocked her people's alliance with what he clearly considered an inferior species. Dave's head emerged from under the table just as General Vorthak finished speaking. The human looked around the room again, this time with a slightly more focused expression, as if he was finally beginning to realize that he might have wandered into something more significant than a routine maintenance call. "Oh," he said, taking in the elaborate costumes, the formal table settings, and the obvious tension in the room. "This is one of those diplomatic things, isn't it? Sorry, I can come back later if this is a bad time." He started to retreat back under the table, but General Vorthak's voice stopped him. "No, human, please continue. We are all fascinated to observe the Drakmor Empire's new approach to statecraft. Perhaps next you will bring in your sanitation workers to advise on interstellar law." The general's chittering grew louder, and several of his subordinates joined in. Princess Lyra felt something cold and sharp twist in her chest. This was supposed to be her moment to prove herself as a diplomat and leader. Instead, she was about to become a laughingstock, a cautionary tale told in diplomatic circles about the dragon princess, who let a maintenance worker ruin the most important peace negotiation in half a century. Dave slowly straightened up, his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked almost like recognition. He glanced at Princess Lyra, then at General Vorthak, then back at the princess. Something in her posture must have communicated her distress because his entire demeanor changed in an instant. The casual, slightly scattered maintenance worker disappeared, replaced by someone who looked far more focused and determined. Dave's shoulders squared, and when he looked at General Vorthak again, his eyes held a quiet intensity that seemed to fill the space around him. "Actually," Dave said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet hall, "she's with me." The words hit the diplomatic hall like a shockwave. Dave stood next to Princess Lyra's chair with his tool belt still jangling softly, completely unfazed by the hundreds of alien eyes now fixed on him. His simple declaration had somehow managed to stop General Vorthak mid-chittering, which Princess Lyra was fairly certain had never happened in recorded history. She stared at this unremarkable human in his stained coveralls, trying to process what had just occurred. In 3 simple words, he had stepped between her and the most feared military commander in the galaxy. Not with weapons or threats or diplomatic immunity, but with the kind of casual confidence usually reserved for someone announcing they were stepping out for coffee. General Vorthak's compound eyes swiveled to focus on Dave, with the intensity of targeting systems locking onto a threat. The Vortak general rose to his full 8-foot height, his exoskeleton gleaming under the crystal lights like polished black armor. His mandibles spread wide in what might have been a smile if smiles weren't supposed to be pleasant, rather than terrifying. "I beg your pardon, human?" The general's voice could have cut through starship hull plating. Dave shrugged, a gesture so human and so completely out of place in the current situation that several alien delegates actually took a step backward. "The princess. She's been helping me with the infrastructure mapping project for the past few days. Really smart lady. Figured out a hydraulic pressure differential that had me stumped for hours." Princess Lyra's mind went completely blank. She had never spoken to this human before in her life. She had certainly never crawled through maintenance tunnels or worked on hydraulic systems. Her entire existence had been carefully scheduled diplomatic functions, military strategy briefings, and formal court ceremonies. The idea that she would know anything practical about space station infrastructure was absurd, but Dave continued speaking as if he were stating obvious facts. I kept telling her she didn't need to dress up for crawling around in service tunnels, but she insisted on wearing the formal gear. Said it was important to maintain proper standards even when doing maintenance work. The hall erupted into confused murmurs as various species tried to process this information. Princess Lyra felt a strange sensation, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted into a completely different configuration. Dave was not just protecting her dignity. He was doing it by creating an entirely fictional scenario in which she was a competent, hands-on problem solver rather than a pampered royal who had never worked a day in her life. General Vorthak's chittering took on a distinctly hostile edge. You expect this assembly to believe that Drakmor royalty would lower herself to manual labor? That a princess of the ancient dragon bloodline would soil her claws with common work? Why not? Dave's response was so casual it was almost insulting. He looked at General Vorthak as if the question genuinely puzzled him. Good honest work never killed anybody. Well, except for that incident on mining station Gamma 7. But that was more about the methane leak than the actual work. Safety protocols, you know? Princess Lyra found herself leaning forward slightly, caught up in Dave's impromptu performance despite herself. She had never heard anyone speak about work as if it were something noble rather than something to be avoided. In her world, physical labor was what other people did so that royalty could focus on more important matters like governance and military strategy. But Dave wasn't finished. He turned back to Princess Lyra with a smile that somehow managed to be both respectful and conspiratorial at the same time. Speaking of which, Your Highness, when you get a chance, could you take another look at that pressure valve configuration you mentioned yesterday? I've got the Sector 7 waste management system backing up again, and I think your solution might work for that problem too. The fictional scenario was growing more elaborate by the moment, and Princess Lyra realized that she was supposed to play along. The problem was that she had absolutely no idea what a pressure valve configuration was, let alone how to fix one. Her education had covered 17 different forms of interstellar diplomacy, the complete military history of the Drakmor Empire, and enough xenobiology to conduct basic conversations with most known species. Practical engineering had never been on the curriculum. General Vorthak's voice rose to a screech that made several of the more sensitive species cover their auditory organs. You address the princess directly? Without proper diplomatic protocol? Without acknowledgement of rank and bloodline? Without, oh, sorry about that. Dave turned back to the general with an expression of patient politeness, like someone explaining something obvious to a particularly slow child. See, that's the thing about humans. We kinda gave up on the whole ritual prostration before genetic lottery winners thing a few centuries ago. Turns out respect works a lot better when it's earned, through actions rather than inherited through bloodlines. The silence that followed Dave's casual demolition of the foundational principle of most galactic governments was so profound that Princess Lyra could hear her own heartbeat. She watched in fascination as this unremarkable maintenance worker continued to systematically dismantle centuries of established diplomatic protocol simply by refusing to acknowledge its importance. Around the hall, alien nobles began shifting uncomfortably. The ethereal's bioluminescence flickered in patterns that suggested deep philosophical disturbance. The granite collective's vibrations took on a frequency that indicated serious recalculation of previously held assumptions. Even the silicon collective's chrome representatives seemed to be processing the implications of Dave's statement with unusual intensity. But Dave wasn't paying attention to their reactions. He had already turned back to his tablet, checking something with the focused attention of someone who had more important things to worry about than galactic politics. Besides, he added almost as an afterthought, the princess has been doing actual productive work for the past 3 days, which is more than I can say for most of the folks in fancy costumes around here. The insult was delivered so casually that it took several seconds for its full impact to register. Dave had just informed the assembled representatives of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations that they were less useful than a dragon princess who had supposedly been crawling through maintenance tunnels. Several alien nobles began muttering, angrily in their respective languages, but Dave was already walking away from the table, clearly expecting Princess Lyra to follow him. His tool belt jangled with each step, the sound somehow more commanding than any royal fanfare she had ever heard. Princess Lyra sat frozen for a moment, acutely aware that every being in the hall was watching her. The choice she made in the next few seconds would define not just her own reputation, but potentially the future relationship between her empire and the human colonial federation. Dave had created a perfect fictional scenario for her to step into, but doing so would mean abandoning everything she had been taught about proper royal behavior. She thought about her father's expectations, about the centuries of tradition she was supposed to uphold, about the carefully planned diplomatic strategy that this incident had already completely derailed. Then she looked at General Vorthak's triumphant expression and realized that the traditional approach was failing anyway. Slowly, deliberately, Princess Lyra rose from her chair. The hall fell silent again as she adjusted her ceremonial armor with as much dignity as she could manage. "General Vorthak," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the vast space. "Perhaps we should continue these negotiations when you're prepared to discuss actual terms rather than throwing childish insults at my technical advisor." The words felt strange in her mouth, but also oddly liberating. She had never in her life referred to anyone as her advisor, unless they had been formally appointed to that position by royal decree. The idea that she could simply decide to work with someone because they were useful and competent was revolutionary. Without waiting for a response from the general or her own delegation, Princess Lyra walked toward the maintenance hatch where Dave was waiting. Behind her, she could hear the hall exploding into confused conversations in dozens of languages. But for the first time in her life, she found herself genuinely curious about what would happen next rather than dreading it. Dave held the hatch open for her with old-fashioned courtesy, completely ignoring the chaos they were leaving behind. "Hope you don't mind getting those pretty scales a little dirty, Your Highness," he said with a grin. "The service tunnels aren't exactly designed for formal wear." Princess Lyra looked back once at the assembly of galactic power brokers, then at the human maintenance worker who had somehow managed to change the entire trajectory of her life in the span of 5 minutes. "Lead the way, Mr. Technical Supervisor," she said. "I believe I have a great deal to learn." 3 hours later, Princess Lyra found herself in a place she had never imagined existing, let alone visiting. Maintenance Bay 12 was a cramped functional space filled with pipes, conduits, and machinery that hummed with the constant background noise of a working space station. The air smelled of metal and lubricants and honest work, completely different from the carefully controlled atmosphere of the diplomatic quarters. Her ceremonial armor had been traded for a borrowed set of coveralls that were several sizes too large, but Dave had assured her that function mattered more than fashion when crawling through tight spaces. The coveralls were clean but well worn, and they carried the faint scent of whoever had worn them before her. It was strangely comforting, like being wrapped in evidence of useful labor. Dave had given her a crash course in basic hydraulic systems, explaining how pressure and flow work together to move liquids through complex networks. Princess Lyra, who had studied stellar engineering at the Royal Academy but had never actually touched a real mechanical system, found the hands-on work surprisingly satisfying. There was something deeply appealing about problems that had clear solutions and systems that either worked or didn't. With no room for diplomatic ambiguity, she was currently focused on a particularly stubborn valve assembly, her claws carefully manipulating the delicate components, while Dave held a work light steady above her hands. The work required patience and precision, qualities she had developed through years of formal court training but had never applied to anything genuinely useful. "See, the thing about pressure systems," Dave was saying, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who genuinely understood his subject, "is that they don't care about your title or your species or how scary you look. Physics is physics. Push too hard in the wrong place and everything backs up. Push in the right place with the right amount of force and everything flows smoothly." Princess Lyra made a small adjustment to the valve and felt the system respond with a satisfying mechanical click. The pressure gauge on the nearby panel shifted from red to green, indicating that flow had been restored to the affected section. It was a tiny victory in the grand scheme of galactic politics, but it felt more real and meaningful than most of the diplomatic successes she had achieved in her life. "Your friend from the dinner seemed pretty upset when we left," Dave commented casually as they moved on to the next system that needed attention. Princess Lyra paused in her work. "General Vorthak represents a species that believes strength is the only virtue worth possessing. The Vortak have been expanding their territory for 3 centuries, conquering what they consider lesser species and enslaving entire worlds. They viewed diplomacy as a temporary inconvenience before inevitable conquest, and they wanted to negotiate with your people because the Drakmor Empire is one of the few remaining powers capable of stopping them. She resumed working on the valve, finding it easier to discuss difficult topics when her hands were busy with practical tasks. We've been at war for 50 years. This was supposed to be a peace summit, a chance to find some kind of compromise that would end the bloodshed. Dave was quiet for a moment, holding the light steady while she worked. When he finally spoke, his words were simple but carried unexpected weight. Doesn't sound like they want peace. Sounds like they want surrender with extra steps. Princess Lyra's hands stilled completely. In 7 simple words, this human maintenance worker had summarized what her father's advisors had been dancing around for months. The Vortak weren't interested in genuine peace. They wanted the Drakmor Empire to voluntarily accept defeat and call it diplomacy. My father believes we can find a middle ground, she said quietly, not sure why she was sharing such sensitive political information with someone she had just met. Maybe you can, Dave replied, but sometimes there isn't a middle ground. Sometimes you have to decide what you're willing to fight for and what you're willing to let go. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Princess Lyra had spent her entire life being told that compromise was the highest form of wisdom, that a skilled diplomat could always find a solution that satisfied everyone. But Dave's casual observation suggested that maybe some conflicts couldn't be resolved through clever wordplay and mutual concessions. Before she could respond, her personal communication device chimed with an urgent message. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet maintenance bay, a reminder that the galaxy's problems couldn't be held at bay indefinitely by hiding in functional spaces with honest work. The message was from her father, marked with the highest priority codes. She read it quickly, her heart sinking with each word. The Vortak delegation had issued an ultimatum in response to her departure from the dinner. They demanded immediate surrender of 3 outer rim systems, formal acknowledgement of Vortak military superiority, and tribute payments in rare metals for the next 50 years. In exchange, they offered to limit their expansion for 5 decades and allow the remaining Drakmor territories to maintain nominal independence. The deadline for acceptance was dawn, less than 6 hours away. Princess Lyra stared at the message, trying to process the implications. Her dramatic exit from the diplomatic dinner, which had felt so liberating in the moment, had apparently convinced General Vortak that the Drakmor Empire was no longer negotiating from a position of strength. Instead of earning respect through defiance, she had simply accelerated the enemy's timeline for conquest. I have to go, she said, suddenly remembering who she was and what responsibilities waited for her beyond this small, functional space. My father needs me. The Empire needs me. Dave nodded without surprise, already reaching for another tool to continue his work alone. There was no disappointment in his expression, no attempt to convince her to stay. He simply accepted her departure as a natural consequence of her obligations, the same way he had accepted her presence as a natural consequence of their shared work. Hey, Princess, he called as she reached the door of the maintenance bay. She turned back, expecting some final piece of advice or perhaps a request to remember him favorably when she returned to her world of power and politics. For what it's worth, Dave said, not looking up from his work. You're pretty good at this stuff. The technical advisor thing wasn't entirely a lie. Princess Lyra felt something warm and unexpected bloom in her chest. In her entire life, no one had ever praised her for being good at practical work, mostly because she had never done any. Her tutors had commended her diplomatic skills. Her military advisors had noted her strategic thinking, and her father had expressed pride in her ability to represent the royal family with appropriate dignity. But no one had ever told her she was good at fixing things, at making broken systems work again. The compliment shouldn't have meant anything. Dave was a maintenance worker, whose opinion carried no political weight and whose approval would never influence her standing at court. But somehow, his simple acknowledgement of her competence felt more valuable than all the formal recognition she had ever received. Thank you, she said, and meant it in ways that surprised her. As she walked back toward the diplomatic quarters, still wearing the borrowed coveralls that smelled like honest work, Princess Lyra found herself thinking about pressure systems and the difference between pushing too hard and pushing in the right place. The Vortak were definitely pushing too hard, trying to force a quick resolution through threats and ultimatums. But maybe there was a different kind of pressure she could apply, something that would make the whole system flow in a different direction. The corridor lights seemed harsher after the warm functionality of the maintenance bay, and the diplomatic quarters felt artificially pristine compared to the honest workspace she had just left. But Princess Lyra walked with a new kind of confidence, carrying the knowledge that she was capable of more than ceremonial duties and formal protocol. She had work to do, but for the first time in her life, she was approaching a diplomatic crisis with the mindset of someone who fixed broken systems, rather than someone who simply managed them. The difference, she was beginning to realize, might be more important than she had ever imagined. Behind her in Maintenance Bay 12, Dave continued working on pressure valves and hydraulic systems, humming quietly to himself as he solved one practical problem after another. He had no idea that his casual observations about physics and compromise had just changed the trajectory of an interstellar war. But then again, he probably would have kept working even if he had known. Some problems, after all, were more important than politics. Princess Lyra arrived at the emergency council meeting still wearing the borrowed coveralls, much to the obvious distress of her father's advisors. The imperial delegation had gathered in the station's secure conference room, their faces grim with the weight of impossible decisions. Emperor Dracus looked older than she had ever seen him, the burden of 50 years of war finally showing in the set of his shoulders and the lines around his ancient eyes. The Vortak ultimatum lay displayed on the central holographic projector, like a death sentence written in diplomatic language. 3 outer rim systems. 50 years of tribute, formal acknowledgement of defeat disguised as a peace treaty. The terms were designed to be humiliating, a public demonstration that even the mighty Drakmor Empire could be brought to heel through sufficient pressure. The council is divided, Emperor Dracus said without preamble as Lyra took her seat at the oval table. Admiral Corax believes we should reject the ultimatum and prepare for total war. Minister Vela argues that accepting these terms would at least preserve the core systems and give us time to rebuild our strength. Princess Lyra looked around the table at the faces of the Empire's most experienced leaders. These were dragons who had guided their people through decades of conflict, whose wisdom had been earned through countless battles and diplomatic crises. They were all older than her, more experienced, more qualified to make decisions that would affect billions of lives across 17 star systems. But as she listened to their careful analysis of military capabilities and resource allocation, she found herself thinking about pressure systems and the difference between pushing too hard and pushing in the right place. The Vortak were applying maximum pressure at what they assumed was the weakest point, trying to force a catastrophic failure that would end the conflict on their terms. What if we're looking at this wrong? Princess Lyra said during a brief pause in the strategic discussion. The table fell silent. Admiral Corax, a massive dragon whose scales bore the scars of a dozen major battles, fixed her with a skeptical stare. Your Highness, perhaps you should change into more appropriate attire before contributing to strategic planning. Princess Lyra glanced down at her coveralls, remembering Dave's casual confidence when he had ignored General Vorthak's attempts at intimidation. Actually, I think these are exactly the right clothes for this conversation. We've been approaching this like a traditional diplomatic problem, trying to find a compromise that satisfies everyone. But what if there isn't a compromise to be found? Minister Vela, the Empire's chief diplomatic officer, leaned forward with interest. Are you suggesting we should reject the ultimatum and fight to the death? I'm suggesting we stop thinking like diplomats and start thinking like engineers. Princess Lyra stood up, moving to the holographic display that showed the current military situation. The Vortak are applying pressure at what they think is our weakest point. They assume we'll choose surrender over annihilation because that's what any rational government would do when faced with impossible odds. Emperor Dracus watched his daughter with growing curiosity. And you believe they're wrong about our weakness? I believe they're wrong about what constitutes strength. Princess Lyra manipulated the display, highlighting the various alien civilizations that remained neutral in the current conflict. Look at this from a systems perspective. The Vortak have built their entire expansion on the principle that superior firepower equals inevitable victory. They conquer species that can't match their military capabilities, then use the conquered resources to fuel further expansion. A proven strategy, Admiral Corax observed grimly, one that has been working for them for 3 centuries. But it only works if everyone accepts their definition of strength. Princess Lyra zoomed in on several of the neutral systems, particularly those with significant human populations. What if we changed the nature of the conflict? What if instead of trying to match their military power, we demonstrated a different kind of strength? The room fell silent as the implications of her suggestion began to sink in. Minister Vela was the first to speak, her voice carefully controlled. Your Highness, are you proposing some kind of alliance with the Human Colonial Federation? Their military capabilities are limited, and their territory is relatively small. I'm proposing we stop measuring strength purely in terms of military capabilities. Princess Lyra thought about Dave's casual dismissal of inherited authority, his insistence that respect had to be earned through actions rather than bloodlines. The humans have something the Vortak don't understand and can't easily counter. They have the ability to inspire cooperation instead of demanding submission. Emperor Dracus rose slowly from his chair, moving to stand beside his daughter at the holographic display. Explain. Princess Lyra took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to propose would sound insane to every experienced diplomat in the room. What if we rejected the Vortak ultimatum not with threats of military retaliation, but with an open invitation for other species to join us in demonstrating an alternative approach to interstellar relations? A public relations campaign. Admiral Corax's voice dripped with skepticism. Your Highness, with respect, the Vortak aren't going to be stopped by good publicity. No, but they might be stopped by a galaxy that refuses to accept their authority. Princess Lyra manipulated the display again, showing trade routes and communication networks that connected dozens of worlds. The Vortak expansion has been successful because they've been able to isolate their targets, forcing each species to choose between individual survival and collective resistance. But what if we made collective resistance the easier choice? Minister Vela began to look thoughtful. You're suggesting we frame this as a choice between two different models of civilization rather than simply a military conflict between the Drakmor Empire and the Vortak Confederacy. Exactly. Princess Lyra felt a surge of excitement as her advisors began to grasp the implications of her proposal. The Vortak represent the old model: strength through dominance, peace through submission, cooperation through fear. We offer the alternative: strength through alliance, peace through mutual respect, cooperation through shared benefit. Emperor Dracus was quiet for a long moment, studying the display with the intense focus that had made him one of the most successful military leaders in Drakmor history. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been hope. It's extremely risky, he said slowly. If we reject the ultimatum and fail to rally significant support, we'll face the full might of the Vortak military without the protection that accepting their terms would have provided. But if we succeed, Princess Lyra replied, we'll have changed the fundamental nature of the conflict. Instead of the Drakmor Empire fighting alone against superior numbers, it becomes the Vortak Confederacy fighting against an entirely different approach to civilization. Admiral Corax stood up abruptly, his massive frame casting shadows across the conference table. Your Highness, this plan requires us to bet the survival of our entire species on the hope that other civilizations will risk their own safety to support an abstract philosophical principle. That's not strategy. That's faith. Princess Lyra met his skeptical gaze without flinching. You're right. It is faith. Faith in the idea that most beings prefer cooperation to conquest, that they'll choose alliance over submission if given a genuine alternative. It's the kind of faith that humans seem to have in abundance. The room fell silent again as everyone processed the implications of what she was proposing. It was unprecedented in the history of interstellar relations, a complete rejection of the established principles of diplomatic and military strategy. It was also, Princess Lyra realized with growing conviction, probably their only chance of victory. Emperor Dracus moved back to his chair, but remained standing as he addressed the assembly. We have 4 hours until dawn. I want detailed analysis of which systems might be willing to support this approach, what resources we can offer to encourage participation, and contingency plans if the strategy fails to generate sufficient response. As the room erupted into urgent planning discussions, Princess Lyra found herself thinking about Dave, probably still working in Maintenance Bay 12, solving practical problems one valve at a time. She wondered what he would think of her plan to apply the principles of hydraulic engineering to galactic politics. Probably, she decided. He would point out that the most important thing was to make sure you were pushing in the right place with the right amount of force. Everything else was just details. The next few hours would determine whether she had correctly identified the right place to push, and whether the force of collective hope would be strong enough to change the flow of an entire galaxy's future. Dawn came faster than anyone wanted. Princess Lyra stood in the main diplomatic hall, now empty of the elaborate decorations from the previous evening's disaster. The crystal chandeliers had been replaced with harsh functional lighting that made everything look stark and serious. Representatives from 17 different species sat at a massive circular table, their expressions ranging from curious to deeply skeptical. The past 4 hours had been a whirlwind of urgent communications and desperate diplomacy. Princess Lyra's plan had evolved from a half-formed idea into something resembling an actual strategy, though she wasn't entirely sure whether that made it more or less insane than her original concept. Emperor Dracus sat at her right, his presence lending imperial authority to what might otherwise have seemed like the desperate gambit of an inexperienced princess. Admiral Corax occupied the seat to her left, his scarred features showing the strain of a night spent calculating military odds that didn't favor anyone in the room. The Vortok delegation had already departed, leaving behind only their ultimatum and a promise to return at exactly dawn to receive the Drakmor Empire's formal response. General Vorthak had made it clear that any delay would be interpreted as rejection, and rejection would mean immediate war. Princess Lyra checked the chronometer on her personal communicator. 3 minutes until the deadline. Around the table, alien representatives whispered among themselves in languages she didn't recognize, their body language suggesting varying degrees of nervousness and excitement. The human delegation had been the first to respond to her overnight communications, which somehow didn't surprise her. Ambassador Richardson, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes, had listened to Princess Lyra's proposal with the kind of serious attention usually reserved for matters of life and death. Which, Lyra supposed, this probably was. The Colonial Federation is prepared to support the Drakmor Empire's alternative approach, Ambassador Richardson had said during their emergency consultation. But I have to ask, Your Highness, are you sure this is going to work? Because if it doesn't, we're all going to be in very serious trouble very quickly. Princess Lyra had given the only honest answer she could. I have no idea if it will work, but I know that surrender definitely won't work, and I don't think we can win a purely military conflict. This is the only option that gives us a chance to change the fundamental nature of the problem. Now, as the final seconds ticked away, she found herself thinking about Dave's observation that sometimes there was no middle ground, that sometimes you had to decide what you were willing to fight for. The beings around this table represented dozens of different species, hundreds of worlds, and billions of individual lives. They had all chosen to risk everything on the hope that cooperation might prove stronger than conquest. The chronometer reached 0 exactly as the main doors opened. General Vorthak strode into the hall, flanked by his usual contingent of heavily armed subordinates, their exoskeletons gleaming like weapons in the harsh lighting. The general's compound eyes swept the assembled representatives with obvious satisfaction, clearly expecting to witness the Drakmor Empire's formal capitulation. Princess Lyra, he announced, his voice carrying easily across the large space. I trust you are prepared to provide your father's response to our generous offer of peace. Princess Lyra stood slowly, acutely aware that every being in the room was watching her. The formal response she was about to deliver had been carefully crafted by her father's most experienced diplomatic advisors. But the core of it came from lessons learned in a maintenance bay from a human plumber who understood pressure systems. General Vorthak, she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. The Drakmor Empire has considered your ultimatum carefully. We reject it completely. The expected response would have been immediate threats of military retaliation, perhaps some grandstanding about the consequences of defying Vortak authority. Instead, General Vorthak's mandibles spread in what might have been amusement. As expected, he said with obvious satisfaction, your species has always been too proud to accept reality. Very well. The Vortak Confederacy will resume military operations immediately. I trust you are prepared for the consequences of your... However, Princess Lyra continued, cutting him off mid-threat, we are not rejecting your ultimatum because we intend to fight you using the same failed strategies that have prolonged this conflict for 50 years. General Vorthak's chittering stopped abruptly. Around the table, alien representatives leaned forward with interest. We reject your ultimatum because we choose to demonstrate a better approach to interstellar relations. An approach based on cooperation rather than conquest, alliance rather than dominance, shared strength rather than imposed submission. Princess Lyra gestured to the assembled representatives. The beings at this table represent the Centauri Republic, the Aquatic Confederation, the Silicon Collective, the Ethereal Council, the Granite Democracy, and 16 other sovereign systems. As of this morning, we have formed a new alliance dedicated to mutual defense and cooperative prosperity. The hall erupted into surprised murmurs as various species began realizing the implications of what they were witnessing. This wasn't a military alliance formed in response to Vortak aggression. It was a complete rejection of the principles that had governed galactic politics for centuries. General Vorthak's compound eyes swiveled to focus on Princess Lyra with laser intensity. You think a collection of weak species can stand against Vortak military might? You think pretty words about cooperation will stop our fleets? I think, Princess Lyra replied calmly, that you've fundamentally misunderstood what constitutes strength. The Vortak Confederacy has built its power on the assumption that fear and isolation will prevent effective resistance. But what happens when entire systems choose cooperation over capitulation? Ambassador Richardson stood up beside her. The Human Colonial Federation formally recognizes the Cooperative Defense Alliance and pledges our full support to its founding principles. One by one, other representatives began standing and making similar declarations. The Ethereal Council's spokesman floated upward in their species' gesture of agreement. The Granite Collective's delegation synchronized their vibrations in a harmonic pattern that translated roughly to unanimous consent. Even the mysterious Silicon Collective activated their external speakers to announce their participation. General Vorthak watched this display with growing incredulity. This changes nothing. You have simply gathered more targets for Vortak expansion. Our fleets will crush this alliance as easily as we would have crushed the Drakmor Empire alone. Perhaps, Princess Lyra acknowledged, but crushing us won't be the end of it anymore. Every system you conquer will become a symbol of what you represent. Domination through fear, peace through submission, strength through brutality. And every system you fail to conquer immediately will become a symbol of the alternative. She manipulated the room's holographic display to show the current political map of the galaxy, then began highlighting systems in blue to represent alliance members, yellow for declared neutrals, and red for Vortak territories. This is no longer a war between the Drakmor Empire and the Vortak Confederacy, she continued. This is a choice between two different models of civilization. Every species in the galaxy will have to decide which approach they prefer, yours or ours. General Vorthak studied the display with obvious discomfort. The alliance systems formed a network that stretched across multiple sectors, connected by trade routes and communication channels that would make them extremely difficult to isolate and conquer individually. You have made a serious mistake, Princess, he said finally. The Vortak do not negotiate with terrorists or insurgents. This alliance will be treated as a hostile military organization, and we will respond accordingly. I'm sure you will, Princess Lyra replied, but that response will demonstrate to every neutral system in the galaxy exactly what Vortak peace looks like. And every time you use force against beings who chose cooperation over conquest, you'll be proving our point about which approach leads to a better future. General Vorthak's chittering took on a distinctly angry edge. We shall see how long your cooperative ideals survive when faced with superior firepower, Princess. The Vortak Confederacy does not lose wars. You're right, Princess Lyra said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The Vortak Confederacy doesn't lose wars. But this isn't a war anymore. This is a choice. And you've just helped every neutral system in the galaxy understand what that choice really means. As General Vorthak and his delegation stormed out of the hall, Princess Lyra remained standing at the holographic display, watching the political map of the galaxy begin to shift in real time as new systems started declaring their positions. The alliance was still outnumbered and outgunned, but for the first time in 50 years, the Vortak were facing something they had never encountered before. An enemy that grew stronger every time they demonstrated their brutality. Around the table, representatives began the complex work of turning philosophical principles into practical military and economic cooperation. It would be difficult, probably impossible, and almost certainly doomed to failure. But as Princess Lyra watched the first green indicators appear on systems that had just declared their support for cooperative defense, she found herself thinking that Dave would probably approve of the engineering approach they were taking to this problem. Sometimes, after all, the best way to fix a broken system was to replace it with something that actually worked. 2 weeks after the diplomatic revolution that shook the galaxy, Princess Lyra found herself back where it all began, in Maintenance Bay 12, wearing borrowed coveralls and working on pressure systems with Dave. The difference was that now she owned her own set of properly fitted work clothes, and 3 different news networks had camera crews trying to get permission to film the Dragon Princess and the Plumber in action. The story had spread across the galactic communication networks with the speed that only truly unprecedented events could achieve. Not the dry diplomatic reports about alliance formations and military positioning, but the human interest angle that somehow captured everyone's imagination. Royalty and commoner working side by side, solving practical problems while the galaxy's power structure shifted around them. Dave seemed completely unfazed by his sudden celebrity status, treating the news crews with the same polite indifference he showed to malfunctioning equipment. When asked about his role in inspiring the Cooperative Defense Alliance, he had simply said, "I just fix things that are broken." Turns out there were a lot of broken things that needed fixing. The political situation was evolving faster than anyone had expected. 17 systems had joined the alliance in the first week after Princess Lyra's declaration. By the second week, that number had grown to 31, with more applications arriving daily. The Vortok response had been predictably aggressive, but also predictably counterproductive. General Vorthak had launched immediate attacks on 3 alliance border systems, apparently expecting quick victories that would demonstrate the futility of resistance. Instead, the attacks had triggered an unprecedented level of mutual aid and cooperation. Human Engineering Corps had arrived to help rebuild destroyed infrastructure. Ethereal medical teams had provided healing services to wounded civilians. The Granite Collective had donated raw materials for emergency construction projects. More importantly, the Vortak attacks had been broadcast live across the galactic networks, providing clear visual evidence of what Vortak peace actually looked like. Systems that had remained neutral for decades began reconsidering their positions as they watched Vortak forces systematically destroying civilian targets. "It's remarkable," Princess Lyra said as she and Dave worked together on a particularly stubborn filtration system. "The more aggressive the Vortak become, the more support we gain from previously neutral systems." "Makes sense," Dave replied, holding a light steady while she adjusted internal components. Bullies usually aren't very smart about public relations. They're used to people being too scared to call them out, so they don't know how to respond when someone stands up to them. Princess Lyra paused in her work, struck by the casual accuracy of his observation. The Vortak have never faced organized resistance before. Every previous conflict has been them against a single isolated species. They don't have strategies for dealing with coordinated mutual defense. Plus, Dave added, they're finding out that conquering systems is a lot harder when those systems keep getting help from their neighbors. It's like trying to fix a leak in one pipe, while all the other pipes in the building keep bursting. You never get ahead of the problem. The comparison made Princess Lyra smile. Dave had an unlimited supply of mechanical metaphors, and somehow they always seemed to illuminate the political situation in ways that traditional diplomatic analysis missed. Her personal communicator chimed with an incoming priority message. The sound had become depressingly familiar over the past 2 weeks, as alliance coordination demands consumed most of her waking hours. But this message was different. It was from her father, and it was marked with the codes reserved for genuinely good news. The Tau Ceti Confederacy just announced their intention to join the alliance, she read aloud. That's 47 systems now, including some of the most advanced manufacturing centers in the galaxy. Dave nodded approvingly. Good neighbors make for good neighborhoods. The more folks you've got willing to help each other out, the harder it becomes for troublemakers to cause serious damage. Another message arrived before Princess Lyra could respond to the first one, then another. Her communicator began chiming continuously as reports flooded in from alliance coordinators across multiple sectors. The Andromedan Trade Guild is requesting observer status, she said, scrolling through the messages. The Crystal Hegemony wants to discuss formal membership. Even the nomadic fleets are asking about mutual defense provisions. The transformation was occurring faster than anyone had anticipated. What had started as a desperate gambit to avoid surrender was becoming a genuine alternative model for galactic civilization. Systems that had spent centuries maintaining careful neutrality were suddenly eager to participate in cooperative ventures. But the most significant development wasn't military or political. It was cultural. "Look at this," Princess Lyra said, showing Dave a message from the Human Colonial Federation's Cultural Exchange Program. They're reporting a 300% increase in applications for interspecies work programs. Beings from dozens of different civilizations want to learn human approaches to problem-solving and cooperation. Dave glanced at the message, then went back to his work with characteristic nonchalance. Makes sense. People like being useful, and they like working with folks who treat them like they matter. Humans aren't special because we're better than anyone else. We're just lucky that our history taught us cooperation works better than conquest. Princess Lyra set down her tools for a moment, studying the human who had somehow become the galaxy's most unlikely diplomatic advisor. "Dave, do you realize what you've started? This alliance, this entire change in how species relate to each other, it all traces back to that moment when you said I was with you." Dave looked up from the valve he was adjusting, meeting her gaze with his characteristic directness. "Princess, I didn't start anything. I just recognized something that was already there." "What do you mean?" "You were already the kind of person who would work alongside a maintenance guy instead of looking down on him. Your people were already the kind of civilization that could choose cooperation over conquest. The alliance systems were already full of beings who preferred building things to breaking them." Dave returned to his work, but continued talking. "All I did was give you permission to be who you already were." The simplicity of the observation hit Princess Lyra like a revelation. The success of the Cooperative Defense Alliance hadn't required anyone to become something fundamentally different. It had simply required them to choose their better instincts over their fears. Another message chimed on her communicator, this one from Admiral Corax. The Vortak had attempted another aggressive expansion, targeting a small independent system called Haven Colony. But this time, instead of facing an isolated, defenseless population, they had encountered a coordinated response from 8 alliance systems. Vortak forces had been repelled with minimal casualties on either side, and the colony had immediately applied for alliance membership. 48 systems, Princess Lyra announced, and according to Admiral Corax, the Vortak are starting to show signs of strategic confusion. They're not used to their aggressive tactics making the situation worse instead of better. Probably never occurred to them that beating up on people would make those people's friends angry, Dave observed. Bullies usually don't think that far ahead. Princess Lyra's communicator chimed again, but this time the message made her stop working entirely. It was from the Vortak Confederacy itself, requesting preliminary discussions about mutual accommodation and spheres of influence. "Dave," she said quietly, "I think they want to negotiate." He looked up from his work, studying her expression. Real negotiations this time? Or just another attempt to demand surrender with prettier language? "I don't know," Princess Lyra admitted. "But it's the first time they've initiated diplomatic contact since we rejected their ultimatum." "Something has changed," Dave nodded thoughtfully. "Makes sense. Hard to keep expanding when every system you attack gets help from 47 of their neighbors. Eventually even bullies figure out when they're outnumbered." Princess Lyra stood up, her mind already racing through the implications and possibilities. The Alliance would need to coordinate their response carefully, ensuring that any negotiations reflected their collective interests rather than just Drakmore Empire priorities. But as she prepared to leave Maintenance Bay 12 once again for the demands of galactic politics, she found herself reluctant to abandon the simple satisfaction of fixing broken systems alongside someone who understood that all beings deserved respect regardless of their species or social status. "Dave," she said as she reached the door, "when this is all over, when we've figured out how to make peace with the Vortak and establish stable cooperative relationships across the galaxy, would you be interested in a permanent position as a technical advisor to the Alliance?" Dave grinned, already turning back to his work. "Princess, as long as there are broken systems that need fixing and people willing to work together to fix them, I'll be right here doing what I do best." Princess Lyra smiled as she walked back toward the diplomatic quarters, carrying with her the knowledge that some things were more important than politics or power, or even peace. Sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply treating other beings as if they mattered. And sometimes the greatest strength came from the simple willingness to work together toward solutions instead of fighting over problems. The galaxy was learning those lessons now, one fixed system at a time, and the future looked brighter because of it. Behind her in Maintenance Bay 12, Dave continued his work, humming quietly to himself as he solved one practical problem after another, completely unaware that he had already solved the biggest problem of all.